All right, so I just wanted to say welcome to this presentation. My name is Andre Cohen, and I am the Chief Facilitator for AM Horizons Training Group. There are a couple of sites where you can see our work. One, again, is andrecohen.com. You can also go to organizationallift.org, and that's with two L's, so L-I-F, F is in Frank, T. So organizationallift.org. And you can also see some of the classes that we offer through ceupartners.org. ceupartners.org. And so today in this particular piece, I want to spend some time kind of talking about how it is that we can work more effectively with our parents. And so as you see here is a quick diagram, a piece that we've been working on for quite a while, and so there are four essential pieces to this diagram. There is human dignity. So how do we work with folks to make sure they have human dignity? How do we use power to actually engage parents in the learning of their children? What is our pedagogy? So what is our process for teaching? And then finally, how do we give access to folks who have either been denied access or don't really know how to engage the school? And so first and foremost, we'll talk about, we'll start with dignity, human dignity. So one of the things that we know is true is that no matter where you come from on the planet, the biological process for creating a human being is that there must be an interaction between male and female, and that when that biological interaction happens, no matter where you are on the planet, the only production that can come out of that biological process is another human. So humans make humans, no matter if they're coming from different places on the planet. So if one person's from China and another is from Brazil, when they interact in that biological process, they will produce a human being. Now, nationalities, governments, regions, cultures, all come out of that initial piece. And so when we talk about human dignity, we're talking about two particular pieces. One is how people identify themselves and the power that comes from recognizing where it is that they come from as human beings. So before I was black, I was human. Before you were white, you were human. Before you were Mexican, you were human. Before you were Hmong, you were human. And so that human dignity must be honored, particularly if we're going to work with our families to help them overcome barriers that have that are things that are plaguing them. So we'll start talking about this human dignity. And so identity, knowing who you are, where you come from, what is your immigration story, what is the story of your people that has allowed you or brought you to a place to even have this conversation, becomes extremely important. There's another piece that I'll bring in a little bit later that talks about the importance of culture and what culture actually is. We've used or talked about culture, but not necessarily talked about the context that culture comes out of. And so we'll spend some time talking about culture and why that is important, particularly when we start talking about identity. And it's very interesting that identity is in relationship with its internal. There's an external identity and then there's an internal identity. And so the external identity is how other people see me, how other people try to recognize, or they're able to look at my phenotype. They look at what what attributes they can physically see about me. But then there is the internal identity that people cannot necessarily see unless we are in relationship with each other. So the things that define who I am that are internal cannot be seen just from the external. And so when we talk about this idea of dignity, dignity is not only something that can be given. It is also something. So I ask people, can you give dignity, or can people have dignity? And the answer is, in fact, that both can exist simultaneously. So you can give dignity to people by honoring their right to exist just as they are, without recognize or without saying that they need to change, or there's a deficit in them in some way, that people can exist exactly how they are. So that's one way that you give dignity, but I also get dignity by demanding it because I'm aware of who I am. Right? So that's the first part. The second part that we'll talk about in this particular diagram is this notion of power. And when I think about power, power is the ability to get things done. And so if we looked at Newton's law of conservation, what Newton teaches us is that power is the ability to do work. It's the ability to get things done. And so in our society, there are certain things that give us power. Money gives us power. Influence gives us power. Popularity gives us power. And influence leads us to power. And so when we talk about this concept of power, and we're talking about our families, how do they have access to goods, jobs, services, and money? And what access do they have to goods, jobs, services, and money? And what goods, jobs, services, and money do they have the ability to manipulate in order to help them achieve their family's goals? And there are some barriers that our families typically experience that are either real, or they are made up. And unfortunately, whether they're made up or whether they are factual and real and can be documented, makes no difference in terms of how people perceive those things. And so one of the three blockages to power is bias. And bias is an emotional response to a group of people that you have limited information about. Right? So bias is an emotional state that folks typically have towards another group because they don't have a logical or factual foundation for their beliefs. And so as teachers, we have to be aware of what is it that what is our bias? What is our emotional state? Are we egalitarian? Do we treat all people the same? Do we have an equity mindset that says I will give people what they need based on their need? Do we have a missionary mindset that I will save these kids in spite of the families that they come from, and in spite of the situations that they're in? Or do we operate from a place of prejudice? And I will be quite frank in stating that we all have prejudice. We all have a preconceived notion about the world. We have preconceived thoughts about the world. And so to deny that we have prejudice is disingenuous. We're not being honest when we don't admit to having prejudice. But prejudice is a thought pattern. It is a way of thinking. And what we know about how we think is that if I'm spurred in the right way, or if people ask me specific questions, then I can start changing how I think. So actually I can change that prejudice. Prejudice is a shortcut. It is shorthand. It's like a habit. It's a way to quickly look at the world and say, is this dangerous? Is this productive? That's what prejudice is. And if we want to get past our prejudice, then we must open ourselves to actually having critical, thoughtful conversations about those areas in our lives that we may even have bias in, right? So bias is the emotional state. Prejudice is the thought patterns, the thought process. And lastly is the last block to power, or the access to power, is discrimination, which is the behaviors that limit people's ability to gain access to power. And so these could be policies, these could be procedures. For example, I was working with a group of criminal justice professionals, and particularly in juvenile justice. And one of the things that they found was that when they sent which was policy, when they sent tickets or citations home with kids, the parents wouldn't get those things, and so kids were being introduced to the criminal justice system in a way that was not productive. And so as a result of that, they were getting bench warrants because they weren't showing up for court. Now, we don't typically talk about or think about that as being a discriminatory practice until we start looking at the result of those practices being negative towards the major population that was being served these citations, which happened to be African Americans. And so to offset that discriminatory practice, what they did was they started calling parents ahead of time saying, this is what's going on, there is a court date for this particular offense. And what they found was that the bench warrants were dramatically reduced because they engaged the parents in this process prior to the bench warrants being offered. And so when we talk about the barriers to power, oftentimes it is as instructors, as teachers, as leaders in educational institutions, what we find is that our personal bias, our feelings about our students and their parents, our prejudice, our thought patterns about our students and their parents, and our policies, practices, and procedures typically, oftentimes, if we're not thinking, are actually discriminatory towards our families and their students that limit their access to power. And so, so we have dignity as the first thing that we have to talk about in terms of engaging our families. Secondly, we have power, or the access to power that's important. And then next we have pedagogy. So how do we teach? What does teaching and learning actually look like? And one of the things that we have to remember is that there has to be a balance between context and culture. That context and culture are related, and there is a direct ratio between those two things. And that pedagogy is an external process that we try to engage our students with so that they internalize these things in order to have some sense of dignity. And so you'll start to see how these four clovers kind of work their way around to support each and every each part of the clover. And so when we talk about context, first, let's go to culture. When we talk about culture, what we're talking about, very simply, is all the things that can be seen and all the values that cannot be seen. So the things that can be seen, we will refer to those as artifacts. And artifacts are the things that you can see, and the values are the things that you cannot see unless you're a part of that culture. Now, what we understand about culture is that the artifacts are the physical manifestation of the values. And so when we see a sombrero, right, what we understand is that that is connected to a set of values that has produced that as a tool for other people to see. Right? So when we see sagging pants, what we understand is that those sagging pants come out of a value system that supports a particular way of thinking. When we see headdresses or we see hijabs, what we understand is that these are not just cultural fashion statements, but these actually come out of a value system that supports that. And so when we talk about culture, we have to talk about the artifacts and the values and how those two things are connected. Now, oftentimes what happens is that when we see artifacts, and they get disconnected from the values, those artifacts become stereotypes. Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen stereotypes, and I've often wondered, isn't that true about that group of people? Well, yes and no. The problem is, what has happened is I see the stereotype or I see the artifact, but I don't understand or have not connected